Close your eyes, and let your mind drift across vast steppes that stretch endlessly toward distant horizons. Imagine a world where the thunder of hoofbeats echoes across grasslands so immense they seem to touch the very edges of the sky. Tonight, we embark on a gentle journey through time, to explore one of history's most remarkable yet often misunderstood civilizations, the Mongolian Empire. As you settle into comfort, allow yourself to be transported to the 13th century, when nomadic horsemen from the remote steppes of Mongolia would come to rule the largest contiguous land empire in human history. This is not a tale of conquest alone, but a story of connection, of how a people from the remote grasslands would bridge east and west, creating pathways for ideas, goods, and cultures to flow like gentle rivers across continents. Let the rhythm of your breathing match the steady pace of Mongolian ponies crossing endless plains. Feel the soft grass beneath you as we begin our journey in the heart of Mongolia, where the story of an empire begins not with grand palaces or mighty cities, but with the simple wisdom of people who lived in harmony with the natural world. The Mongols were, at their core, children of the steppe, a people whose lives moved with the seasons, following ancient rhythms of migration that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest changes in history come not from the centers of power, but from the quiet margins of the world, where people live close to the earth and understand the deeper currents of life. Tonight, as you rest, let this ancient story wash over you like a gentle breeze across the grasslands, carrying with it the scent of wild flowers and the whispered secrets of a remarkable people who changed the world. In the beginning, there was the endless sky. Tingri, the eternal blue heaven that stretched like a vast protective dome over the rolling grasslands of Mongolia. Beneath this infinite canopy lived a people who measured time not by the ticking of clocks, but by the migration of herds, the turning of seasons, and the slow dance of stars across the night sky. The Mongolian steppes in the 12th century were a world unto themselves, a sea of grass that rolled in gentle waves from the Altai Mountains in the west to the forests of Manchuria in the east. Here, where the horizon seemed to curve with the very shape of the earth, lived scattered tribes of nomadic herders who had perfected the art of moving with the land rather than against it. Picture, if you will, a gur, a traditional felt dwelling that the Mongols called home. Round and sturdy, designed to withstand the fierce winds that swept across the steppes, these portable homes could be dismantled and packed in less than an hour. The gur represented everything beautiful about Mongolian life, practical yet elegant, temporary yet enduring, simple yet perfectly adapted to its environment. Inside these cozy dwellings, families gathered around central fires, sharing mare's milk fermented into arag, telling stories passed down through generations, and teaching children the ancient skills of horsemanship and archery. The smoke from countless fires would rise straight up through the roof opening toward Tingri, carrying with it prayers and dreams that seemed to dissolve into the infinite blue above. The Mongols organized themselves into tribes, the Merkits, the Taikids, the Karaits, and many others, each with their own grazing territories and time-honored traditions. These tribes moved across the steppes in predictable patterns, following grass and water, their movements as natural and inevitable as the migration of birds or the flow of rivers toward the sea. Among these tribes, in the year 1162, a child was born who would be given the name Temujin. His birth was said to have been marked by an omen. He clutched a blood clot in his tiny fist, which the shamans interpreted as a sign that he would become a great leader. But for now, he was simply another child of the steppe, learning to ride before he could properly walk, his small hands growing strong on the reins of gentle ponies. The world into which Temujin was born was one of both beauty and hardship. Winters on the steppe could be brutal, with temperatures dropping far below freezing and winds that cut like knives through even the thickest felt clothing. The Mongols called these harsh winters Zud, and they could devastate herds and leave families struggling to survive until spring brought new grass and hope. Yet there was profound beauty in this harsh land. Summer brought wildflowers that painted the grasslands in brilliant colors, purple asters, yellow buttercups, and delicate white daisies that nodded in the constant breeze. The air was so clean and clear that stars seemed close enough to touch, and the Milky Way stretched across the night sky like a river of light that shamans said was the path that souls took to reach the eternal blue heaven. The Mongols lived by a code that emphasized loyalty to family and tribe, respect for elders, and reverence for the natural world. They believed that all things, the wind, the grass, the animals, the sky itself, possessed spirits that must be honored and appeased. This worldview shaped everything about their culture, from their gentle treatment of the land to their complex relationships with neighboring peoples. As young Temujin grew, he learned the essential skills of steppe life. He learned to milk mares and prepare arag, to felt wool into warm clothing, and to read the subtle signs in weather and terrain that could mean the difference between life and death on the vast grasslands. Most importantly, he learned to ride with the fluid grace that made Mongol horsemen legendary, becoming so attuned to his mount that horse and rider moved as one being. The relationship between the Mongols and their horses was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their culture. These small, sturdy ponies, descendants of wild horses that had roamed the steppes for thousands of years, were incredibly resilient. They could survive on grass alone, dig through snow to find forage, and travel vast distances without tiring. A Mongol warrior might own dozens of horses, switching mounts frequently to maintain a relentless pace across the steppes. But Temujin's childhood was not destined to be peaceful. When he was still young, his father Yasujii was poisoned by members of a rival tribe, leaving the family vulnerable and alone on the unforgiving steppe. This tragedy would shape the future conqueror, teaching him that survival required not just skill and strength, but cunning and the ability to forge alliances in a world where tribal loyalties shifted like the grass in the wind. As we drift deeper into this ancient story, let your mind rest on the image of those endless grasslands, where a young boy learned lessons that would one day reshape the world. Feel the gentle movement of the earth beneath nomad camps, the soft whisper of wind through grass, and the vast, comforting presence of the eternal sky watching over all. The transformation of young Temujin into the leader who would become known as Genghis Khan is a story that unfolds slowly, like the gradual changing of seasons on the steppe. It was not a tale of sudden destiny fulfilled, but rather the patient work of years, as a remarkable young man learned to navigate the complex world of tribal politics, alliance-making, and survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Following his father's death, Temujin's family faced immediate hardship. Cast out by their own tribe, they were forced to survive on their own, scraping together a living by fishing, hunting small game, and gathering roots and berries from the steppe. These were humbling years that taught the future Khan valuable lessons about loyalty, resilience, and the importance of never abandoning those who depend on you. During this difficult period, Temujin was captured by a rival tribe and held prisoner, his neck locked in a wooden collar called a kang. But even in captivity, his natural leadership qualities shone through. He eventually escaped with the help of sympathizers who recognized something special in the young man's character. This experience taught him that even enemies could become allies under the right circumstances, a lesson that would prove crucial in his later conquests. As Temujin matured, he began to attract followers through a combination of personal charisma, military skill, and an unusual approach to leadership that set him apart from other tribal chiefs. Rather than relying solely on traditional bloodline claims to power, he earned loyalty through merit, treating his followers with respect regardless of their tribal origins and sharing both the hardships and rewards of steppe life. One of the most important relationships in Temujin's early life was his friendship with Jamuka, another young nobleman who would eventually become his greatest rival. In their youth, they were blood brothers, sharing the sacred bond of Anda that was one of the strongest ties in Mongol society. They hunted together, shared their dreams of the future, and learned from each other the arts of leadership and war. But as both young men gathered followers and began to establish themselves as leaders, their different visions for the future of the Mongol people gradually drove them apart. Jamuka represented the traditional way, maintaining the old tribal divisions and hierarchies that had governed steppe life for generations. Temujin, however, began to envision something entirely new, a unified Mongol nation that would transcend tribal boundaries and create strength through unity. The process of unifying the Mongol tribes was like the careful braiding of horsehair into rope. Individual strands that seemed weak alone became incredibly strong when woven together. Temujin understood that the constant warfare between tribes was weakening all of them, making them vulnerable to more powerful neighbors like the Jin dynasty of northern China, who often played Mongol tribes against each other to prevent any one group from becoming too strong. His approach to building alliances was both pragmatic and innovative. Rather than simply demanding submission, he often incorporated defeated enemies into his growing confederation, offering them positions of honor and responsibility based on their abilities rather than their previous tribal affiliations. This meritocratic approach was revolutionary in a society where birth and bloodline had traditionally determined one's place in the world. Temujin also showed remarkable skill in managing the complex web of relationships that governed steppe politics. He arranged strategic marriages, honored ancient customs and traditions while slowly reshaping them to serve his larger vision, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to know when to fight and when to negotiate. His growing reputation for fairness and effectiveness began to attract not just warriors, but also shamans, craftsmen, and other valuable members of society. The military innovations that Temujin introduced were as important as his political skills. He organized his forces using a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, that allowed for much more flexible and coordinated tactics than the traditional clan-based fighting groups. He also promoted commanders based on ability rather than birth, creating a leadership structure that rewarded competence and loyalty above all else. Perhaps most importantly, Temujin understood the psychological aspects of warfare and leadership. He cultivated an aura of invincibility while also showing genuine care for his followers. He shared hardships with his men, remembered their families, and ensured that the benefits of victory were distributed fairly. This combination of strength and compassion created an incredibly strong bond between leader and followers. The final confrontation between Temujin and Jamuka came at the Battle of Dalan Bal's Hut, where years of growing tension finally erupted into open warfare. The battle was fierce but decisive, and when it ended, Jamuka's forces had been scattered to the winds. The capture and execution of his former friend was a sorrowful moment for Temujin, marking the end of his youth and the beginning of his transformation into something larger than a mere tribal leader. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, the United Tribes of Mongolia proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The ceremony took place beneath the eternal blue sky, with representatives of all the major tribes present to witness this historic moment. As shamans chanted ancient prayers and the smell of burning incense drifted across the gathering, a new chapter in world history began. The newly proclaimed Genghis Khan stood before his people not as a conqueror, but as a unifier. His vision extended far beyond the steppes of Mongolia. He dreamed of an empire that would bring peace and prosperity to all peoples, where trade could flow freely and different cultures could coexist under the protective umbrella of Mongol rule. As you listen to this ancient tale of transformation and unity, let your mind rest on the image of that great assembly, where thousands of nomads came together under the vast sky to witness the birth of an empire. Feel the sense of possibility and hope that must have filled the air that day, as a people long divided finally found the unity they had been seeking. With the Mongol tribes finally unified under his leadership, Genghis Khan turned his attention beyond the familiar grasslands of his homeland toward the vast world that lay beyond the steppes. What followed was not merely a series of military campaigns, but a remarkable expansion of human connection across continents, a bridging of civilizations that would fundamentally change how people, goods, and ideas moved across the earth. The first major target of Mongol expansion was the Western Xia Kingdom, a Tibetan-speaking realm that controlled crucial trade routes between China and Central Asia. The campaign against Western Xia served as a proving ground for the unified Mongol forces, allowing them to test their new military organization and tactics against settled opponents while also securing vital resources and experience. The Mongol approach to warfare was uniquely suited to their nomadic heritage. Their armies moved with the same fluid efficiency that had characterized their seasonal migrations as herders, covering vast distances with remarkable speed and appearing where enemies least expected them. Each warrior maintained multiple horses, allowing the army to maintain a pace that left their opponents struggling to respond effectively. But it was not speed alone that made the Mongol military so effective. Genghis Khan had created a remarkably disciplined and organized force that could execute complex maneuvers with precision. The decimal system of organization meant that commanders at every level knew exactly how many men they could count on and how to coordinate with neighboring units. This systematic approach turned the traditional chaos of steppe warfare into something resembling a deadly choreographed performance. The siege of Beijing in 1215 marked a turning point in Mongol expansion, as they demonstrated their ability to capture even the most heavily fortified cities. Rather than relying solely on their traditional cavalry tactics, the Mongols showed remarkable adaptability, incorporating Chinese siege engineers and their advanced technologies into their military machine. This willingness to learn from and adopt the innovations of other cultures would become one of the empire's greatest strengths. As the Mongol armies moved westward, they encountered the flourishing Islamic civilization of Central Asia, with its magnificent cities like Samarkand and Bokhara that served as jewels along the Silk Road. The initial contacts between the Mongols and the Khwarezmid Empire might have remained peaceful. Genghis Khan actually sent envoys seeking trade relationships rather than conquest. The tragic misunderstanding that led to the destruction of the Mongol trade caravan at Otra was like a stone dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that would spread across continents. When the Khwarezmid Shah ordered the execution of Mongol envoys, a violation of diplomatic protocol that was considered one of the gravest possible offenses, he unknowingly triggered one of history's most devastating military campaigns. The Mongol response was swift and overwhelming. Moving across the vast steppes of Kazakhstan with their characteristic speed, Mongol forces appeared at the borders of Khwarezmia like a sudden storm. The psychological impact of their arrival was perhaps as important as their military effectiveness. Word of their approach spread faster than the armies themselves, creating panic and confusion that worked to the Mongols' advantage. The siege and capture of Samarkand in 1220 demonstrated the Mongols' evolving military capabilities. This ancient city, protected by massive walls and defended by experienced warriors, fell to the Mongols in just 5 days. The speed of the victory was achieved not through brute force alone, but through careful planning, effective use of siege engines, and the psychological warfare that had become a Mongol specialty. What happened after the conquest of these great cities reveals much about Mongol character and priorities. While popular imagination often focuses on destruction, the reality was more complex. The Mongols were primarily interested in resources, trade, and administrative control. Craftsmen, scholars, and merchants who could contribute to the empire were often spared and even elevated to positions of importance. The Mongol Empire's approach to governance was remarkably pragmatic and tolerant. Rather than imposing their own culture on conquered peoples, they generally allowed local customs and religions to continue unchanged, asking only for loyalty and tribute. This approach proved far more effective than attempts at forced conversion or cultural domination, as it reduced resistance and encouraged cooperation from subject populations. As Mongol forces pushed into Eastern Europe, they encountered a world that was completely different from anything they had experienced before. The dense forests of Russia, with their scattered wooden cities and different style of warfare, required new adaptations. Yet once again, the Mongols proved remarkably flexible, learning to fight effectively in forested terrain and developing new tactics for capturing wooden fortifications. The winter campaign against the Kievan Rus demonstrated the Mongols' incredible endurance and determination. While most armies of the era avoided major campaigns during the harsh winter months, the Mongols actually preferred fighting in winter, when frozen rivers became highways for their cavalry and their hardy Mongol ponies had advantages over the larger horses used by European knights. The psychological impact of Mongol expansion across Eurasia cannot be overstated. For centuries, the peoples of Europe and Asia had lived in relative isolation from each other, with only limited contact through trade routes and diplomatic missions. The sudden appearance of these masterful horsemen from the remote steppes shattered old assumptions about geography and power, forcing established civilizations to reconsider their place in a much larger world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this great expansion was not the military conquests themselves, but what came after. As Mongol administration took root in conquered territories, something unexpected began to happen. Trade routes that had been disrupted by constant warfare began to flourish again. Scholars and craftsmen found new opportunities to share their knowledge across vast distances. Different cultures began to interact and influence each other in ways that had never been possible before. The Pax Mongolica. The Mongol peace was beginning to emerge from the chaos of conquest. Like gardeners who clear away weeds to allow flowers to grow, the Mongols were creating conditions for an unprecedented flowering of human exchange and cultural development across Eurasia. As you contemplate this remarkable period of expansion and change, imagine yourself as a traveler on those ancient routes, watching as barriers between civilizations dissolved and new possibilities for human connection emerged across the vast expanse of the known world. In the wake of their great conquests, the Mongols achieved something that perhaps even they had not fully anticipated: the creation of the world's first truly global trade network. Under the protective umbrella of Mongol rule, the ancient Silk Road experienced a renaissance that would facilitate an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures across the vast expanse of Eurasia. Picture, if you will, a merchant caravan preparing to leave the bustling markets of Venice in the year 1270. The merchants load their pack animals with European woolens, glassware, and precious metals, knowing that their goods will be eagerly received in the markets of Beijing or Samarkand. What makes this journey possible is not just the profits to be gained, but the remarkable safety and efficiency that Mongol rule has brought to the overland trade routes. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, was perhaps the most sophisticated communication network the world had ever seen. Stretching across thousands of miles from Eastern Europe to the Pacific coast of Asia, this system of relay stations provided fresh horses, food, and shelter for official messengers who carried the empire's correspondence. A message could travel from Karakoram, the Mongol capital, to the farthest reaches of the empire in a matter of weeks rather than months. But the yams served purposes far beyond official communications. It created a reliable infrastructure that merchants could use, knowing that they would find supplies and security at regular intervals along their routes. The psychological effect of this reliability cannot be overstated. For the first time in history, a merchant could plan a journey from Europe to Asia with reasonable confidence that the route would remain safe and passable throughout the long months of travel. The Mongol approach to trade was refreshingly straightforward. Rather than the complex web of local taxes, customs duties, and tolls that had traditionally plagued overland commerce, the Mongols imposed a single, standardized tax system that was both predictable and relatively reasonable. Merchants knew exactly what they would owe and could plan their ventures accordingly. This standardization extended to weights, measures, and currency as well. A bolt of silk measured in Samarkand would be the same length when it reached the markets of Kiev. Silver coins minted in one part of the empire were accepted at face value throughout Mongol territories. This consistency dramatically reduced the transaction costs and uncertainties that had previously made long-distance trade so risky and expensive. The effects of this trade renaissance rippled through every aspect of society. In the great trading cities along the Silk Road, Bokhara, Samarkand, Kashgar, and many others, cosmopolitan communities developed where merchants from dozens of different cultures lived and worked together. These cities became melting pots of human diversity, where a traveler might hear conversations in Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Mongolian, and half a dozen other languages as he walked through the bazaars. The exchange of goods was accompanied by an equally important exchange of ideas and technologies. Paper-making technology, which had originated in China, spread westward along the Mongol trade routes and eventually reached Europe, revolutionizing communication and record-keeping. Similarly, Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge traveled eastward, contributing to scientific advances in Chinese and Mongol courts. Medical knowledge also benefited enormously from this cultural exchange. Chinese physicians learned about Islamic medical practices, while Islamic doctors gained access to Chinese diagnostic techniques and herbal remedies. The Mongols themselves, with their practical approach to governance, actively encouraged this sharing of medical knowledge, recognizing its value for maintaining healthy populations throughout their empire. Perhaps nowhere was this cultural fusion more visible than in the arts. Mongol patronage led to remarkable innovations in painting, sculpture, and decorative arts as artists from different traditions worked together and learned from each other. Persian miniature painting began to show Chinese influences, while Chinese ceramics incorporated Islamic design motifs. The result was a flowering of artistic expression that created entirely new aesthetic traditions. The movement of people along these trade routes was as significant as the movement of goods. Craftsmen traveled to find new markets for their skills, scholars journeyed to study at distant centers of learning, and diplomats carried messages between courts separated by thousands of miles. This human mobility created networks of personal relationships that extended across continents, making the vast Mongol Empire feel more connected and integrated. Religious exchange also flourished under Mongol rule. The Mongols' traditional religious tolerance meant that missionaries and pilgrims of various faiths could travel safely throughout the empire. Buddhist monks journeyed from Tibet to Mongolia, Islamic scholars traveled from Persia to China, and Christian missionaries followed trade routes deep into Asia. This religious mobility led to fascinating syntheses and mutual influences between different spiritual traditions. The famous travels of Marco Polo during this period provide us with a vivid window into this world of expanded possibilities. When young Marco set out from Venice with his father and uncle, he was embarking on a journey that would have been nearly impossible just a century earlier. The fact that the Polo family could travel safely from Europe to China, spend years at the court of Kublai Khan, and return with detailed accounts of their experiences speaks to the remarkable transformation that Mongol rule had brought to Eurasian travel. Marco Polo's descriptions of the cities he visited reveal the prosperity and sophistication that flourished under Mongol protection. His accounts of Khanbalik, modern Beijing, with its broad streets, magnificent palaces, and bustling markets, show us a cosmopolitan capital where people from across the known world came together in commerce and culture. The Mongols' own lifestyle was also transformed by this cultural exchange. Originally nomadic herders whose material culture was necessarily simple and portable, many Mongols found themselves ruling over sophisticated urban civilizations with complex administrative needs. They adapted with characteristic pragmatism, learning from Chinese bureaucrats, Persian administrators, and other educated peoples who could help them govern their vast territories effectively. This period of the Silk Road Renaissance was not without its challenges. The sheer scale of the Mongol Empire made consistent administration difficult, and local variations in policy and practice were inevitable. Pirates and bandits continued to pose threats in some regions, and natural disasters could disrupt trade routes for months at a time. Yet for nearly 2 centuries, the Mongol Empire provided something that had never existed before, a reliable, safe, and efficient system for moving people, goods, and ideas across the largest landmass on Earth. The consequences of this achievement would outlast the empire itself, creating patterns of connection and exchange that continue to influence our world today. As you imagine this remarkable period of human connection and cultural exchange, let your mind drift along those ancient trade routes, where caravans moved like slow-flowing rivers carrying the treasures and wisdom of many civilizations toward distant horizons. Beyond the thundering hooves and military conquests that often dominate popular understanding of the Mongol Empire, there existed a sophisticated legal and social system that provided the foundation for governing the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The Yasa, or Great Law of Genghis Khan, represented one of history's most remarkable attempts to create a unified legal framework that could accommodate the diverse peoples and cultures within the vast Mongol domains. The creation of the Yasa emerged from Genghis Khan's deep understanding that military conquest alone could not sustain an empire. True lasting power required the consent of the governed, and consent could only be earned through fair and consistent treatment of all peoples, regardless of their origins or previous allegiances. The Great Law was thus both a practical tool of governance and a philosophical statement about the nature of justice and human society. At its heart, the Yasa embodied principles that were revolutionary for their time and remarkably modern in their implications. The law proclaimed that all people, from the highest nobles to the humblest herders, were equal before the law and subject to the same rules and penalties. This concept of legal equality was virtually unknown in the hierarchical societies of medieval Eurasia, where justice typically varied according to one's social status and birth. Religious tolerance was another cornerstone of Mongol law that set the empire apart from most contemporary powers. Rather than imposing their traditional shamanistic beliefs on conquered peoples, the Mongols actively protected the right of all subjects to practice their own religions freely. Buddhist monasteries, Islamic mosques, Christian churches, and Taoist temples all received imperial protection and often generous patronage from Mongol rulers. This religious tolerance was not merely a matter of practical politics, though it certainly served practical purposes by reducing resistance to Mongol rule. It reflected a deeper Mongol understanding that spiritual wisdom could take many forms and that different peoples might find different paths to understanding the divine. The Mongol concept of Tingri, the eternal blue sky, was expansive enough to encompass various religious traditions as different expressions of the same underlying cosmic order. The Mongol legal system also established unprecedented protections for merchants and travelers. Trade routes received special imperial protection, and interfering with commerce was considered one of the gravest possible crimes. Merchants who received imperial passports could travel throughout the empire with confidence that their goods and persons would be protected by local authorities. This legal framework was essential to the flourishing of Silk Road commerce during the Mongol period. Women enjoyed remarkably high status under Mongol law, especially compared to their counterparts in many settled civilizations of the time. Mongol women could own property, participate in business, and even rule as regents when their husbands were absent or deceased. Several Mongol khattuns, queens, wielded significant political power, and their counsel was actively sought on matters of state policy and military strategy. The meritocratic principles embedded in Mongol law extended to all aspects of governance and military organization. Positions of authority were awarded based on ability and loyalty rather than noble birth or hereditary privilege. This system allowed talented individuals from humble backgrounds to rise to positions of great responsibility, creating a dynamic and capable administrative class that could effectively govern the empire's diverse territories. Environmental protection was another aspect of Mongol law that demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of sustainable resource management. Regulations governed hunting seasons, protected breeding grounds for wild animals, and established penalties for wasteful or destructive practices. These laws reflected the nomadic Mongols' deep connection to the natural world and their understanding that human prosperity depended on maintaining ecological balance. The Mongol legal system also established comprehensive welfare provisions for widows, orphans, and others who might otherwise be vulnerable to exploitation. These social safety nets were not merely expressions of compassion, but practical measures to ensure that all members of society could contribute productively to the common good. A society that protected its most vulnerable members was ultimately stronger and more stable than one that allowed suffering and desperation to fester. Diplomatic immunity was strictly enforced under Mongol law, reflecting their sophisticated understanding of international relations. Ambassadors and envoys received absolute protection, and harming a diplomatic representative was considered an act of war. This principle facilitated the complex negotiations required to maintain relationships between the empire and neighboring powers, while also providing channels for peaceful resolution of conflicts. The Mongol approach to justice emphasized restoration and rehabilitation rather than simple punishment. When possible, criminals were given opportunities to make amends for their offenses and reintegrate into society as productive members. This restorative approach to justice recognized that human beings could change and that society benefited more from reformation than from revenge. Record-keeping and documentation were given high priority under Mongol law, reflecting their practical approach to governance. Official decrees were translated into multiple languages and distributed throughout the empire to ensure consistent implementation. Court records were carefully maintained, and legal precedents were documented to provide guidance for future cases. This systematic approach to legal administration was remarkably advanced for its time. The concept of collective responsibility was another important aspect of Mongol law that helped maintain order across vast territories. Communities were held accountable for the actions of their members, creating powerful incentives for self-policing and mutual support. This system reduced the need for extensive imperial bureaucracy while ensuring that local communities had strong motivations to maintain peace and stability. As the Mongol Empire evolved and matured, the Yasa continued to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its core principles of fairness, tolerance, and meritocracy. Local variations developed in different parts of the empire, reflecting the Mongol tradition of pragmatic flexibility, but the fundamental commitment to equal treatment under law remained constant. The influence of Mongol legal principles extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries. Ideas about religious tolerance, meritocratic governance, and legal equality spread through trade networks and diplomatic contacts, influencing legal developments in societies that never came under direct Mongol rule. The concept that law should apply equally to all people, regardless of their status or background, became one of the Mongol Empire's most enduring contributions to human civilization. Today, as we grapple with questions about how to create just and inclusive societies in our interconnected world, the Mongol legal tradition offers valuable insights. Their success in governing a remarkably diverse empire through principles of tolerance, merit, and equal treatment under law demonstrates that unity does not require uniformity, and that strength can emerge from diversity when people are treated with fairness and respect. As you reflect on these ancient principles of justice and governance, consider how the wisdom of the great law continues to resonate across the centuries, reminding us that the foundations of any lasting civilization must be built on fairness, tolerance, and respect for the dignity of all people. As our gentle journey through the story of the Mongol Empire draws to a peaceful close, we find ourselves contemplating not endings, but transformations, the way that great movements in history never truly disappear, but instead flow into new forms, like rivers finding new channels while continuing their eternal journey toward the sea. The political empire that Genghis Khan and his successors built eventually fragmented, as all human institutions must, but the deeper changes they brought to the world proved far more enduring. The connections they forged between East and West, the networks of trade and cultural exchange they established, and the principles of tolerance and meritocracy they championed continued to shape human civilization long after the last Mongol Khan had passed from the stage of history. In the quiet libraries of China, scholars continue to study and preserve texts that had been translated during the Mongol period, when Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and European knowledge traditions first came together in systematic ways. In the markets of Central Asia, merchants still followed trade routes that had been secured and systematized under Mongol rule, carrying goods and ideas across the same vast distances that Mongol messengers had once traveled. The Mongol legacy lived on in subtler ways as well. In the genetic heritage of millions of people across Eurasia, in the linguistic borrowings that enriched languages from Korean to Russian, in the architectural styles that blended nomadic and settled traditions, and in the culinary traditions that combined ingredients and techniques from across the known world. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrated that it was possible for diverse peoples to live together in relative peace and mutual prosperity, governed by laws that recognized their common humanity while respecting their cultural differences. This lesson, learned on the vast grasslands of Mongolia and applied across continents, remains relevant as we navigate the challenges of our own interconnected world. The traditional Mongol reverence for Tengri, the eternal blue sky, reminds us that some things transcend the rise and fall of earthly powers. The same sky that watched over Genghis Khan's first victories continues to arch over the Mongolian steppes today, where herders still live in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world, following migration patterns that connect them to ancestors stretching back through countless generations. As you prepare to return to your own rest, carry with you the peace of those endless grasslands, where the horizon stretches beyond sight and the sky seems infinite in its protective embrace. Let the gentle wisdom of the Mongol people, their respect for diversity, their commitment to fairness, and their deep understanding of humanity's connection to the natural world, settle into your thoughts like a soft breeze across the steppes. The story of the Mongol Empire is ultimately a story about connection, about the ways that human beings, despite their differences, can find common ground and create something greater than the sum of their parts. In our modern world, as we face challenges that require global cooperation and mutual understanding, we can draw inspiration from these nomadic horsemen who proved that unity and diversity are not opposites, but complementary forces that together create the conditions for human flourishing. Close your eyes and imagine yourself beneath that eternal blue sky, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the steppe, the whisper of wind through grass, the distant call of birds, and the soft breathing of sleeping horses. Feel the earth beneath you, solid and reassuring, connecting you to all the generations of people who have found rest and renewal in harmony with the natural world. The Mongol Empire may have passed into history, but its deepest teachings remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago. In a world that often seems divided, we can remember the Mongol example of finding strength in diversity. In times of rapid change, we can recall their remarkable adaptability and openness to learning from others. When facing challenges that seem insurmountable, we can draw inspiration from their patient persistence and their understanding that great achievements unfold slowly, like the changing of seasons on the eternal steppe. As sleep gently approaches, let your breathing synchronize with the natural rhythms of the earth, deep and slow, like the breathing of the steppe itself. Allow the story of the Mongol Empire to settle into your consciousness not as a tale of conquest and power, but as a reminder of humanity's capacity for connection, understanding, and peaceful cooperation across all the boundaries that might seem to divide us. The eternal blue sky of Tengri watches over us still, vast and peaceful, embracing all peoples and all stories within its infinite compassion. Under that same sky, in the gentle darkness of night, we find the rest and renewal that connects us to the deeper rhythms of existence, where all differences dissolve into the unity of peaceful sleep. May your dreams carry you across vast steppes of possibility, where the horizon stretches endlessly forward and the sky above holds infinite promise for the dawn that will surely come. Rest now, as the children of the eternal sky have rested for countless generations, secure in the knowledge that you are part of a story much larger than yourself, a story of human connection, wisdom, and hope that continues to unfold beneath the vast, protective dome of heaven.